Hey X-Files and TV fans, bored now back to review and meet my cool little green friend who's joining me for this review. So just water tonight, cheers. Shouldn't do that on camera, but he'll be joining me a lot for these X-Files review. And on this video I will be talking about episode 10 of season 2. It is called Red Museum, so full spoilers from the start. I'll try not to hiccup my way through this one. Just a few facts. This aired originally on December the 9th, 1994, and it originally on the night it aired, it got a Nielsen rating of roughly 10.4 million, which sort of translated to an average of 9.9 million with the share for that night. Overall, including reruns, it got roughly 16.1 million, so pretty strong ratings again for the show at this point. This episode is written by Chris Carter. It's directed by Wim Phillips, whose name I don't remember appearing before, but he may have done in one or two. He's certainly not a regular on the X-Files, so first time I remember seeing his name. And as I said, Red Museum. So the premise of this episode is then in a small Wisconsin town, you start having like teenagers being kidnapped and appearing in like forests, sort of semi-naked, and they've got this message on the back: "This is the one," or "You are the one," so something like that. And the first team we see this happen to, like in the pre-credits sort of sequence, is the son of this woman who works at the local meat farm packing factory. And this is this is connected to what's going on and these kidnappings and at first the local sheriff and many of the locals blame it on this Church of the Red Museum of the title, because they are vegetarian and they don't get on with the locals in town, and there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of kind of bullying that at one point we see some of the local teens bullying one of the Red Church members, and they're set up as the main sort of suspects. But as the episode goes on, different things are revealed, and the way it ends up going is then it's connected to the government injecting hormone stuff into the local meat, and so obviously teenagers or anyone who eats that meat become sort of aggressive. And there's actually a link to the end of season 1, the finale of that, where it appears anyway, and Mulder certainly believes that it's alien DNA being injected into the cows. And there's this whole thing where the doctor of this town, who's apparently paying this other guy, or is, he's actually the guy who it turns out shot Deep Throat. Scully remembers him from that. So it's sort of, in the end, because for a long time it feels largely like just a standalone type episode, but in the end it does actually tie into one of the bigger mythologies of the show. So we get more on that, which is interesting. So to sum up the episode, I think it's the definition really of a very sort of forgettable episode. It's the sort of episode that you put it on and you watch it fine enough, and it has its moments, but it doesn't leave much of a lasting impression. I mean, only maybe in the sense of that stuff at the end and when things are revealed just where it's going, then it sort of becomes significant. But obviously that's later in the episode anyway. But putting that to the side anyway, it's just not a very memorable episode, like scene from scene. I think, obviously, again, I said I don't recognise the director, Wim Phillips, and he doesn't really bring much of a style to it. I think there's maybe a couple of scenes that visually are quite good to look at. There's a scene with Mulder, searching in this room in like the back of the house of the woman who works at the meat packing factory, and that looks quite good visually, but one or two scenes, but overall not a lot really stands out from the direction. I think overall it's a very middle of the road episode that isn't going to last long in the memory, and I guess if for completion's sake it's it's one you're still going to watch, but apart from how things develop at the end, if you skipped over it, I don't think you would really regret it. But in any case, I think it's there's nothing in it which is like really terrible neither. So I think it is definitely the definition of a middle of the road episode. And I think the problem with those sorts of episodes is then they don't stand out one way or the other, because sometimes when you get like a really bad episode, or just an episode that is like very off the wall and crazy and you're not quite sure about either way, at least those episodes give you something to talk about or just something to take away and remember. Whereas if it's just like middle of the road like this and not that much going on, it doesn't really pique your interest that much. It doesn't like live long in the memory. And I think that sums this one up quite well. It's saved by a couple of things, I would say. First of all, there's a couple of like classic Mulder lines which are just brilliant. The first one is because they're sort of talking about, at one point he's describing to Scully like this Red Museum and this idea of walk-ins when they're having all these new people walk in and obviously converting them to the church and their beliefs. And he says Abraham Lincoln was a walk-in. And I like that because it's, it's a nice bit of mythology building when it comes to this Red Museum. And I think when they tie it to historical figures like that, I think it does give it credibility. Now, whether that's true or not, I wouldn't have any idea, but it was a nice touch. But the line I'm talking about is when Scully mentions Nixon, did he sign up or something? And Mulder's like, well, no, not. They don't even want to take credit for Nixon, which is a brilliant dig at Nixon there. And the other line of the episode from Mulder is when they're interviewing this guy Odin, who's sort of like the head of the church, and Mulder responds at one point and says, for a holy guy, you've sure got a knack of pissing people off. That is classic Mulder. That's just great stuff. So those two lines, and as I said, the fact that they do at least tie it into some mythology with the twist, and it's sort of interesting because I guess apart from the fact that they're using alien DNA, there's actually no sort of supernatural or unworldly elements in this episode. It's a rare sort of thing. Before I move on, actually, I should point out something else. Then a fact I learned today on the wiki page. So I'm going on the wiki page. I mean, it could be just some people having fun with us on the internet, but according to the wiki page at least, this episode was originally meant to be like a crossover with the soap picket fences, believe it or not. So there you have it. There's a fact for you guys. I don't know how that would have worked out, but yeah, very bizarre. But apparently that was once the plan, to have this be a crossover with picket fences. There you have it. Make of that what you will. So it's kind of mostly a bland episode, as I said. I think there's a few problems. First of all, the title Red Museum and the characters of this church, it's really misleading, and it's a red herring, obviously, because they turn out not to be the ones involved behind these like kidnappings, and later there's a murder. But I think I have no problems with red herrings. I think in this case it's a poorly handled one, because first of all, they're not very interesting as characters. They don't really stand out. I think the leader of the church, this Odin guy, I think just doesn't have a lot of personality, and as characters, I think there's some decent mythology set up by Mulder, but outside of that, as characters in the whole church, they just feel very one note and forgettable. And it's just, I think, like a lot of the characters and drama in this one, it's like they don't feel sympathetic enough to like really care about one way or the other. And at the same time, even if you're setting them up as like villains or potential villains, they just don't feel that threatening, or then they really stand out as characters enough for that neither. But yeah, I think it's actually a bit over the top to name the episode Red Museum, considering then they are basically a red herring. It's not like they take up a fair amount of the episode, and I think that's what bothers me. I think it's a bit over the top to have them so heavily featured when in the end it turns out that then it's not even them who's behind all this. And to actually name the episode after them is, yeah, I think that's over the top. And I think it's just a poorly handled like red herring in any case. So I think that's definitely one problem. And I think just from a storyline point of view, there doesn't seem to be enough of a link between them and what then happens later on. And just looking at the twist and where it leads, in the end, although I quite like them tying it to like the season 1 finale and sort of paying that off, it obviously comes quite late in the episode, so it's sort of too late to really save the episode much. But also, just I think some of this stuff about the cows and injecting hormones in them and stuff like that, it's just very generic, very mundane, and sort of on the nose, and at times it just gets a bit silly and goofy. And I think overall the episode suffers because the supporting characters just aren't that interesting to like watch and listen. So you get like the sheriff's son and a group of friends who start bullying like one of the Red Church members, and they're just very generic teenage sort of bullies. There's a couple of decent cast members. I quite like the guy who plays the sheriff, although I think by the end, because the sort of like ending feels quite anticlimactic, because in the end, because they're going after this doctor character, who and he ends up shooting him like the sheriff. He just like loses it, and that just feels like anticlimactic as well. But I should talk a bit more, because there's this whole thing. I almost forgot, actually. There's this whole thing with, like, yeah, the guy who's actually injecting them with the hormone serum. And yeah, it's this local guy, and it turns out he's just a bit of a perv, and so he has all these videotapes. And there's this scene which I'm like mentioned before with Mulder in the house of the meat packer, because the opening of the episode is quite well done, because you actually see this guy looking through a peephole at like the mother in the shower, like the woman who works at the meat plant. And I like that actress. I've seen her in some other stuff, so I think she's one of the better performances in this. And it makes you think that she's the one who's going to be like harmed or something, whereas they actually go after the son. But anyway, yeah, just this guy who it turns out he's a bit of a pedo, because he has all these tapes, and he's the one who's been injecting the cows, and the one who's been kidnapping. Although when one of them shows up dead, he claims it wasn't him, and it turns out it wasn't. It turns out it was like the doctor, the one working for the government, as a way to try and cover things up. But I think that's another problem. Then it sort of gets a bit too convoluted with too many things going on at once at the end. It's almost like it just feels like a bit of a muddle of a plot. And just going back to the picket fences thing, I think that would have been, I don't know if that's one of the reasons why it gets a bit messy, because maybe if they were planning originally to have that, although I'm guessing maybe, or it would have been, is that it just would have been like a character from Picket Fences who shows up in this episode. I don't know how big a role they would have had, but I'm just wondering if that could have been a factor in it becoming a bit of a mess. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, as interesting as some of the stuff at the end is, I think at times the script is a bit of a mess, and there's sort of too much going on. And as I said, mostly it's just a very bland, forgettable episode, which is disappointing. It's middle of the road. It's certainly not terrible, and there's not really much in it which is offensive. But as I said earlier, I think sometimes some of the more cheesy bad episodes end up being a bit more memorable than this. This isn't memorable. I mean, apart from those Mulder lines and maybe the odd, I mean, there's not many scenes that are memorable in it. I guess it's just a bit interesting because of the payoff at the end. But yeah, if I was choosing to stick on an X-Files episode randomly, this would be very low down the list of what I would actually choose. Because, as I said, there's episodes that are like cheesy bad, but quite entertaining with it, that I would choose before this. So that's Red Museum. I'll give it 5 out of 10. It's middle of the road, as I said. So 5 out of 10 sounds about right. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. Share me out on social media, and also support the channel on Patreon. Patreon.com/boardnow, and for that you get extra content bonuses, including exclusive commentaries of film and TV episodes. And speaking of the X-Files, I am actually doing X-Files commentaries on there. I've done the first couple of season 1, so look out for more on Patreon. And also I'm doing movies now this month, doing some Christmas commentary. So It's a Wonderful Life is already up on there. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon with more X-Files. Take care and goodbye.